Let's go. All right. Hello. Let's start with a quick prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, one God, amen. Illumine our hearts, O Lord Jesus Christ, our God, with the pure light of thy divine knowledge. Open the eyes of our mind to the wonders of your gospel teaching, and plant in us also the fear of thy blessed commandments, the trampling down all carnal desires. We may enter a spiritual manner of living, both thinking and doing such things as are well-pleasing unto thee. For thou art the illumination of our souls and bodies of Christ our God. To thee we ascribe glory together with that originate Father, and thine holy good life giving Spirit, now and ever, and unto ages of ages. Amen. Okay, so this is a class on hospitality. Compassionate hospitality is what I'm calling it. And what I'm doing for the beginning is just trying to present a groundwork that is found scripturally to give us at least a sense of where it is that I'm going with this particular thing. But as we get into the later classes, we're going to deal with some, particularly with Father Zacharias of the monastery in Essex. He has some very fascinating things to say, some very important things to say about those things. So we will take a look at his writings towards the end of the class, which will come sometime in November. Okay. So I want to touch or come back to what we talked about last week with regard to Eden, because there are a couple of things that come out of Eden that I think are important for us as we get a target in what we're dealing with here. So as we talked about last week, the Garden of Eden itself is a place where God's presence permeates everything. Okay, so imagine eating, but everything that's eaten is blessed by God. So everything has that communal sense. Everything that they ate, aside from one thing, everything that they ate had that blessing of God and was provided by God for not just us mortals, but also the animals and everything that dwell. Okay. It's an important theological point for our church anyway, to understand that that is at the focal point of existence before the fall. Okay. Adam and Eve would not have died, and they certainly wouldn't have had the experiences that they had they not done what they did. But their choice in doing what they did invited into their existence a decision that involves what I would call blatantly selfishness. Okay, there was one thing that God did not bless. And so that means there's one thing that they could eat that would be a selfish act as opposed to one that desired communion with God. And that is the very thing that they did. They ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Okay, they didn't keep away from it like they were told to. And they did this for selfish reasons. Eve looks at the apple, it's good to behold. And then she tastes it and sees that it's good. Okay, and so she eats it, and then she gives it to her husband. He eats it, and then everything starts to fall apart. What's the first thing they do after they realize that after they touch the fruit, they realize they're naked, right? What do they do next? They clothe themselves, right? Yeah, they put on clothes. You know what that is? It's a selfish act. They're putting a barrier between themselves and their vulnerability and God. Okay? So they're just continuing down this road of doing things that they want to do as opposed to the things that would be blessed by God. Okay? This, I would say, is the beginning of inhospitality. Right? Wouldn't you say? Sure. A selfish act, something that's doing something for oneself, is not hospitable. Okay. So then the next thing that happens is you have God asking them what happened, and Adam immediately blames his wife. And then when Eve is questioned, she immediately blames the serpent. So no one is willing to take any kind of accountability. We've touched on this in the past also. Okay. So no accountability, which leads to a total fall. Now, here's the thing though, because of their realization that they're naked, and because they are now in a situation where their communion with God has actually been broken. Okay? What does God do? He amplifies their senses. He helps them see. He helps them hear. He helps them have a sense of taste and touch. So if they put their hand over a fire, they'll know that's a really bad idea and they'll pull their hand back. Okay? So all the senses that we rely on now amplified after the fall because they needed those senses to survive. Okay, they needed those senses to know if there was something dangerous lurking about. They needed their senses to see if there was something that they could eat. They needed all of that. And God provided that through the basic essence of who we are as God's creatures, as human beings. Okay. Now, one of the things that Father Alexander Schmemann says in his book For the Life of the World is that one of the things that is another result of the fall is that no more is food communal. In fact, no more is food alive. Think about it. Everything we eat is dead, especially animals. We don't want to eat living things, right? Everything is dead. Okay. So that means there's no life in it. Even an apple, when you remove it from a tree, it's dying, right? And that's what happens. If you leave it out too long, it rots and it gets bad, right? So there's nothing living that we consume, okay? And that's a part of our march towards our own mortality. The things that we touch and taste and everything else become an object unto themselves, and they do not have life in them. And as a result, it becomes difficult for us to be able to tap back into that remembrance of how things were before the fall. There's one thing that still does have life in it, and I find this very interesting, and that's the Eucharist. Okay? Think about it. What do we use for the Eucharist? We use bread and wine. And what does bread and wine have in it but microbes, yeast, that help, that enliven? That's what the description would be in New Testament terms, and even in the early church. Bread rose because it was alive. There was something in it that caused it to live. Okay. And the wine ferments because there is something alive in there as well. And they were aware of this. I was just having a conversation with one of our parishioners yesterday who likes to make homemade wine, and he rushes the process by throwing yeast into it. Well, yeast is going to cause it to enliven. It's going to grow, okay, and ferment. Okay, so the interesting thing is, and I realize that wine and other things, those are still things that are, part of our normal daily life, but in the Eucharist itself, we receive the body and blood of Jesus Christ. And so through that, we do have life in it. Okay, so what God has done is taken these things and given us little helps along the way. So he continues to show his mercy towards us, even though we struggle, even though we have to work for these things. We have to till the fields. We have to yank out the weeds, as we all well know. We have to do those kinds of things so that we can have the fruit that we want to eat in its due season. Since Noah, we're allowed to eat animals. Okay, and the same thing, though. I mean, if we've talked about this ad nauseum in this church, but when we eat a hamburger, it involves a life-taking sacrifice on the part of the animal. Okay, there's not ever a time when we have a hot dog or a hamburger or something like that where something hasn't died for it. Okay, so there is that still that element to it. Okay, so God has provided, and so there is that form of hospitality, but then it's incumbent to us. Now, from the time of Adam through Noah up to the point of Abraham, so we're still in the book of Genesis, first 11 chapters. Okay, there isn't a whole lot of assignment that's given, like God's expectations on what they are to do and not to do. Okay, that comes a little bit later, but we do have Noah being seen as righteous when everybody else wasn't righteous. So there were still things that were happening at that point. But even then, in God's mercy And in his care, he tells Moses to have hospitality for the animals, to take care of the animals so that they can be preserved in the ark. Okay. And so they're preserved in the ark, and they managed to survive for the amount of time that the rain came, for 40 days and 40 nights. And then the extra time that came to let the waters recede, and then the animals could be free and go out and do whatever it is that they were called to do. But in God's mercy, those things were preserved by the instructions that God gave to Noah to build the ark that he built. Okay? And just as a reminder, the pairs of animals are for regular animals, but when those animals are involved in the practice of sacrifice, and remember that sacrifice was something that was pretty much instilled from the beginning. Abel and Cain had to make sacrifices. Noah had to make a sacrifice. Okay, so God told Noah 7 pairs of whatever animal is required for sacrifices, because you need the animals in order to make the sacrifice. Okay, that's always been a part of all of this too. And the practice of sacrifice is something that we're going to talk about this evening. But key to that is that sacrifice is the gift of first fruits. It's the best we have to offer. It's not our excess. It's not whatever we feel is left over. It's not like we take account of what we have and then decide, well, with the extra, we can just go ahead and give that out. When God expected a sacrifice from his people in the Old Testament, all those animal sacrifices that you're aware of, those really are first fruits. They are things that were meant to be the best of the best. Okay, so I'm going to call a timeout for a second. Debbie, are there things that he can play with?
Yeah, I wasn't sure.
It's okay. I mean, I don't want to, I mean, it's not that
No,
he's fine. And he's not disturbing me. I just want him to be, to have something to kind of mess around with. Sorry, I didn't mean to single you out or anything, but just want to give him an opportunity to do something kind of fun. Okay, so when we look at the Old Testament, as we may be aware, the Old Testament is broken down into 3 major sections. Okay, there's the section of the law called the Torah. It's the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And then the second would be called the prophetical books, the Nevi'im in Hebrew. And so that would be like the prophet Isaiah or the prophet Ezekiel. Each one has their own separate book in the Bible. And so those would be the prophets that I'm thinking of. Elias is also a prophet, but he doesn't have his own book. His writing or his actions are found either what we would call third and fourth kingdoms, or they'd be found in First and Second Kings. And then the third type is called the wisdom literature. And in wisdom literature, we have the Psalms and texts like that. Okay, there are historical books like Kings and Samuel and Chronicles and things like that, but they are sort of categorized in the wisdom literature themselves. Okay, so for our import today, what we're going to talk about today, we're going to focus on the Torah, because there are several texts in there that we may not be aware of. And I also want to talk about an example of really great hospitality and then an example of really lousy hospitality. So any questions so far? Mother, do you have any questions?
Just, I struggle a little bit about things being dead that we eat, because they were eating from everything in the garden except the animals prior to the fall.
Right.
So they were eating dead things too.
Well, we
right?
don't know what they were eating. Okay,
Well,
because
they were told they could eat.
There's an essential change in that food from what we eat now. It's not the same thing. It's not the same fruits. So we don't know what that is. I mean, I thought of that too, but that's, I understand what you're saying, but remember, when that fruit was eaten, or that food, whatever it was, that had in it the blessing of God.
Okay.
Okay. And the food that we eat now doesn't have that. Okay. Not in the same way. I mean, we can bless the food, We say a prayer to bless the food, but it's not the same thing. It's not a communion with God in the same sense that it was before the fall. And this is, Father Alexander says there's only one thing that wasn't imbued with that blessing, and that was what they ate.
Okay.
Okay. I know that's a bit of a theological hair splitting, but the bottom line there is that everyone ate in communion with God prior to the fall. And now the only time that we can do that is the Eucharist.
Eucharist. Okay.
Yeah. Any other questions? Do you have any questions? Okay. This might be a heavy. I'm sorry if it is, but it's okay. All right. So the first thing in the Torah I want to take a look at is the book of Leviticus. Now, the book of Leviticus is not one of the historical books per se, because Genesis talks about the lives of Adam and Eve and Abraham and Joseph and all of that. Exodus talks about Moses and his journeys and all of that. But Leviticus gets into the rules of things that are to happen. Numbers and Deuteronomy, in like manner, do the same kind of thing, okay? But I want to read to you this passage. It's a long passage, but it just gives you a sense of the expectations that people had in the time of their practice of journeying in the wilderness and then finally settling down in the promised land. So these are some of the expectations, especially when it comes to the feasts that are celebrated and the growing of crops. So it says this: the Lord said to Moses, this is Leviticus 23, say to the people of Israel, the appointed feasts of the Lord, which you shall proclaim as holy convocations, my appointed feasts, are these. 6 days work shall be done, but on the seventh day, a Sabbath of solemn rest. A holy convocation, you shall do no work. It is a Sabbath to the Lord in all of your dwellings. And we know this, okay? It's Saturday in the Hebrew faith, and there is no work that is to be done, okay? We know this. Jesus was dealing with this in his time. And to this day, we still have people who practice, very observant Jews, still do no work on the Sabbath day on Saturday. They go to the synagogue, and that's all they do. Okay, these are the appointed feasts of the Lord, the holy convocations, which you shall proclaim at the time appointed for them. So this is another set. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month, in the evening, is the Lord's Passover. And on the 15th day of the same month is the feast of unleavened bread to the Lord. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall have a holy convocation. You shall do no laborious work, but you shall present an offering by fire to the Lord 7 days. On the seventh day is a holy convocation. You shall do nothing involving labor. Okay, so let's think about that for a second. Remember the experience that Moses had when he was telling Pharaoh to let the people go. All sorts of plagues happened, right? And so he turned the Nile into blood. There was a plague of toads. There was a plague of locusts. There was boils. There was lice. I mean, all sorts of fun things that was visited. And Moses, or Pharaoh had his own magicians and wizards try to duplicate, and sometimes they did to some degree, but they never really fully reproduced what Moses did on through God's bidding. But in all of that, the Pharaoh still refused to let his people go. Okay, still refused to let his people go. And so finally, there was the angel of death. And so the angel of death, God told Moses, prepare your people, have them put the blood of a lamb on the lintels, the doorway of your houses. Okay, and the angel of death will pass over those houses, but will kill the firstborn of anything that is not under that protection. Okay, and so, you remember the Cecil B. DeMille movie where the creepy tendrils come in and kill everything that doesn't have that protection, but the ones that are, God sends his angel of death, and it passes over the houses that are protected and only kills those that are not under protection. Okay, that's why it's called Passover. All right, so the passing over preserves life. All right, Pharaoh says you can go. Well, Moses says you guys need to eat, but you need to prepare your foods. We've got to get out of here. Okay, and so they have, amongst other things, unleavened bread. Okay, and the unleavened bread is because they don't have time to let the bread rise. So they eat unleavened bread and they flee. Well, the Passover Seder that was celebrated after they get to the promised land and everything settles down, which is a remembrance of their time in Egypt, the angel of death, and they're having to flee in a hurry so that they could get to where they were going without the threat of Pharaoh doing them harm. All of that is wrapped up into the Passover Seder, which is what is mentioned here. Okay, so that's why it says that there's a feast of unleavened bread. The bread was prepared quickly so that they could just eat it and go, or eat it on the run, in fact. You know, if you ever had matzah, you know what it's like. It's a flat bread like a cracker. Okay, that is the bread that they eat during the Passover meal. There are other things that they have in the Passover Seder as well, lamb and a mixture of sweet and bitter herbs as a reminder of God's deliverance, but also their time of suffering, both under the hand of Pharaoh, but also in their journey. God did provide, but it was not an easy trip. Okay, so there's that sweetness and the bitterness. Okay, and all of that is part of this particular meal. We know about this because that's the time that Jesus was crucified. Also, he was betrayed, and he was humiliated, condemned, scourged, and then crucified. All right. So continuing on with this passage, and the Lord said to Moses, say to the people of Israel, when you come into the land which I give you and reap its harvest, you shall bring me the sheaf of the first fruits of your harvests to the priest, and he shall wave the sheaf before the Lord, that you may find acceptance. On the morrow, after the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it. And on the day when you wave the sheaf, you shall offer a male lamb, a year old, without blemish, as a burnt offering to the Lord. Okay, so we get all this information, okay, about what they are supposed to do. The first fruits of their harvest, okay? And remember, when they're making this kind of offering, they're making the best they've got to give, but it was not easy to grow crops. Anyone remember the Dust Bowl? I mean, it was not in our lifetimes, but you're familiar with the Dust Bowl out in Oklahoma? Because there was no rain, so they could grow no crops. And people starved, and it was horrible. Okay, we don't have that problem. We are so fortunate that way. Of course, we also get tomatoes in February, right? Where are those tomatoes from? I can promise you they're not from Newcastle. Probably from Chile. Right? So we have the ability to get food from all over the place now. So that idea of food scarcity and really depending on God for our help diminishes because of our ability to have these things brought to us from all over the world. Okay, but when they had a successful harvest, when they were in that position where they could have decent food, it was expected of them to give thanks to God first. Okay, because God, through his mercy, and in a sense, through his hospitality, he gives the fruit to grow, the wheat and everything else to grow and to be ripe for harvest. And then they take that and they wave it in the form of a sacrifice in the presence of God. Okay. And there is a cereal offering, which is the produce that comes from the grain. And then 2/10 of an ephah of fine flour mixed with oil, whatever an ephah is, to be offered by fire to the Lord, a pleasing odor. And a drink offering with it shall be of wine, 1/4 of a hin, whatever hin is. And you shall eat neither bread nor grain, parched or fresh, until this same day, until you have brought the offering of your God. It is a statute forever throughout your generations in all of your dwellings. Okay, so here I think is a dire warning. Going back to the time of Cain, Cain refused to make the offering with a willing heart, and so his offering was rejected. And so this is a message that even before you eat anything out of what you have harvested, you give the first thing to God. Okay? And that it is done in a remembrance of everything that God has done for us. So it's supposed to be out of thanksgiving, and yes, out of obligation, but also out of love and gratitude to God for what we have been given. Okay? Make sense? All right. Getting to the point shortly. And you shall count from the morrow after the Sabbath, from that day that you brought the sheaf of the wave offering, 7 full weeks shall they be, counting 50 days to the morrow after the 7th Sabbath. Then you shall present a cereal offering of new grain to the Lord, and you shall bring from your dwellings 2 loaves of bread to be waved, made of 2/10 of an ephah. They shall be of fine flour. They shall be baked with leaven as the first fruits of the Lord. And you shall present with the bread 7 lambs a year old without blemish, and 1 young bull, and 2 rams. And they shall be burnt. They shall be a burnt offering to the Lord, with their cereal offering and their drink offerings, an offering by fire, a pleasing odor to the Lord. And you shall offer 1 male goat for a sin offering, and 2 male lambs a year old as a sacrifice of peace offerings. And the priest shall wave them with the bread, and of the first fruits a wave offering before the Lord, with the 2 lambs. They should be holy to the Lord for the priest. And you shall make proclamation on the same day, and you shall hold a holy convocation, and shall do no laborious work. It is a statute forever in all your dwellings throughout your generations. Okay, a lot of sacrifices. Okay, a lot of sacrifices. And that is the part of our existence. These sacrifices are essential in the well-established relationship between God and his people. These were the expectations. And it was always giving to God the best you have to give. Best you have to give. Okay. And finally, to the point. And when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap your field to its very border, nor shall you gather the gleanings after your harvest. You shall leave them for the poor and the stranger. I am the Lord your God. Okay, so you are responsible for planting seeds all throughout your fields. But as you do your work, and as you are cultivating everything, every once in a while, seeds are going to go in a place where you can't get at them for whatever reason. And we've talked about this before, but when you think about how they did work in their fields, it was a team of oxen with a man, and in the middle, there was some kind of furrowing tool, okay, a plow. And so as the farmer has the plow, he's directing the oxen to do whatever it is that they're doing. And when he has to make a turn, he's going to turn, but it's not a right angle turn. It's not a sharp turn like this. It's a curved turn. Okay, and so he'll curve here, and then 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 he'll just keep going inward, like in a concentric circle, probably, right? So what happens then is that the seed, though, is thrown everywhere. So the seed is all throughout the property, not just in the areas that have been dug into troughs, but everywhere, okay? And it's those areas, the areas around the outside of the field, that will grow wild, but they'll still grow. And so there is an opportunity there for food to grow, right? And they're not going to be cared for the same way that the field itself is cared for. But that is meant to be preserved for the poor and the resident alien, okay? So even in that time, when we tend to think of, how, the Old Testament tends to be so saturated with the ideas of brutality and revenge and all that kind of stuff. But in this case, they are expressing a specific concern for people who do not have anything. And not everybody had property, and not everybody had wealth. So what were they to do? They were not going to starve. God would not let them starve. And so they were able to provide for themselves, not to the same quality of life the farmers themselves would have, but they would still be able to provide for themselves based on gleaning. That's where we get the word gleans from, like a gleaner, when we collect coins and put them. What is that? It's our leftovers, right? That we collect. Yep. So the gleaning then is meant for the poor. Okay. So even there, we have a mandate from God that we are to care for the poor, and we are to care for the stranger, for somebody who does not belong where we are. Okay. Yep. So that's a very important point for us as we ponder, God's expectations as we see them in the Old Testament. Okay, any questions to this point? To make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a question, Mother?
No.
Okay.
Makes good sense.
All right, good. Okay, so let's use that as the foundation point. Okay, that even when they're tilling the fields, they still have a responsibility to care for the other. We could talk about jubilees. I don't have that listed here, but a jubilee is every 7 years, all debts are wiped clean. Everything starts from nothing. And that year, even the crops rest. Hopefully they have gathered enough over the years that they have enough to eat. Because if you think about it, even today, farmers don't always till their fields. Okay, like if it's a soybean, there's a lot of soybeans where, down in the Maryland area where I'm familiar. And every few years, they will let the field stay what they call fallow. Okay, which is just to not plant anything in it, because the soil needs to rest. Plants need nutrients in order to grow. And if you continue to steal the nutrients for these plants, eventually the soil itself will become sterile or infertile. So you have to let the soil rest. It has to have a time when it is not serving the purpose that you intend it to serve. Or people tend to rotate crops. It's another way that you can keep the soil rich, is by having corn 1 year and soybeans the next year, or something like that. I don't know. I'm not an agriculturalist. But the general idea is you have to keep it circulating. In this day, they just didn't do it. They didn't grow anything. They had a year of Jubilee. What a fascinating concept that is. Okay. And again, when we tend to think about how unrighteous things are in that day with all the, slaying of the Moabites and so forth, the idea of wiping clean debts, it's an interesting concept. Of course, the whole reason why people get into debt, it's an interesting concept, which we definitely will not talk about in this class, but might need to in the future. Okay, so there we go. Now, as we take a look backwards now, Leviticus is part of the law that was inscribed from God to Moses. So Moses is later generation. We have Abraham, who starts out the covenantal relationship between God and his people, and the circumcision becomes the focal point of that. That is the sign of God's connection with the people of Israel. Okay, Israel doesn't come until after Isaac. So you have Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Jacob's name by God is Israel. Okay, literally meaning the one who strives with God. And they all are part of the group that starts the journey into a relationship with God. But Moses is the lawgiver. He's the one that God imparts all of the law to. Now, we know the 10 Commandments. It's way more than the 10 Commandments. Okay, the Torah and the instruction that is found there. This is why Paul rails against it so much, because there's no way, honestly, especially in the day of Christ, that everyone could live into the rules that were imposed in the Torah. There was just no way. And they didn't even bother. And this is why Jesus is so angry with the Pharisees and the Sadducees because they tell everyone else they have to abide by the rules, but they don't abide by them themselves. They take their cattle and they water them, and they take them away from the manger. So that's work. That's some effort you have to put forth in order to move an animal from its feeding trough to its watering trough. And they don't see any problem with that, but they'll yell at somebody else that does it, right? We have hypocrites in this day and age too, don't we? So yes, that's why he does that. But the Torah comes from Moses onward. But I want to talk today now about Abraham. Okay, in chapter 18 of the book of Genesis, we have the story that I'm about to tell you. It goes like this. And the Lord appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre, as he sat at the door of his tent in the heat of the day. He lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, 3 men stood in front of him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them, bowed himself to the earth, and said, My Lord, if I have found favor in your sight, do not pass by your servant. Isn't that nice? That is hospitality. Okay? 3 men, and he falls before them, and he begs them to stay with him. Let a little water be brought, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree, while I fetch a morsel of bread, that you may refresh yourselves, and after that you may pass on, since you have come to your servant. So they said, do as you have said. So they assented to his offer. And Abraham hastened into the tent to Sarah and said, Make ready quickly 3 measures of fine meal, knead it, make it into cakes. And Abraham ran to the herd, took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to his servant, who hastened to prepare it. Then he took curds and milk, and the calf which he had prepared, and set it before them. He stood by them under the tree while they ate. So you can imagine that took a little bit of time. Okay, because you got to cook many animals, right? And you also have to make cakes out of the meal, and you have to deal with the milk and all of that. So he gave that all to them. And so he's showing a lot of generosity, a lot of hospitality. And they said to him, Where is Sarah, your wife? And he said, She is in the tent. The Lord said, I will surely return to you in the spring, and Sarah, your wife, shall have a son. And Sarah was listening at the tent door behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in age, had ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. In other words, she had hit menopause. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, After I've grown old, and my husband old, shall I have pleasure? And the Lord said to Abraham, Why did Sarah laugh and say, Shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? And at the appointed time I will return to you in the spring, and Sarah shall have a son. But Sarah denied it, saying, I did not laugh, for she was afraid. He said, No, but you did laugh. How about that? Even then, they're still not willing to say they did what they did. That happens a lot with Abraham and Sarah, by the way, not just here. Okay, then the men set out from there. They looked towards Sodom, and Abraham went with them to set them on their way. The Lord said, Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do, seeing that Abraham shall become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall bless themselves by him? No, for I have chosen him, that he may charge his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he has promised him. Then the Lord said, Because the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great and their sin very grave, I will go down to see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry which has come to me. And if not, I will know. Okay, so we have had the telling of the hospitality of Abraham, and he has exceeded the generosity. He has given them a feast, and they have blessed him by telling him what's coming, a son, the heir, the one who is going to help them become this great nation, right? Because Isaac is coming. Okay, just a little clue for you. The name Isaac is Hebrew, Yitzhak, which means laughter. Laughter. Because she laughed. Okay, so Yitzhak is literally to laugh. Okay. All right. So the men turned from there and they went toward Sodom, but Abraham still stood before the Lord. Then Abraham drew near and said, "Wilt thou indeed destroy the righteous with the wicked? Suppose there are 50 righteous within the city. Wilt thou then destroy the place and not spare it for the 50 righteous who are in it? Far be it from thee to do such a thing, to slay the righteous with the wicked, so that the righteous fare as the wicked. Far be it from thee. Shall not the judge of all earth do right?" And the Lord said, "If I find at Sodom 50 righteous in the city, I will spare the whole place for their sake." So what are we seeing there? Abraham is begging for mercy for the people of Sodom. So even there, his mercy, his hospitality, his compassion extends beyond his own well-being and aimed towards the well-being of the city. Now, let's also remember his nephew is there. Lot is in the city. So it may be that he's acting out of self-interest, but no, because we'll see in a little bit that Lot is told to leave and he does. Okay, so it's not just that. Okay. Suppose 5 of the 50 righteous are lacking, says Abraham to the Lord. Wilt thou destroy the whole city for lack of 5? And he said, I will not destroy it if I find 45 there. Again he spoke to him, saying, Suppose there 40 are found there. He answered, For the sake of 40 I will not do it. And then he said, Oh, let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak. Suppose 30 are found there. He answered, I will not do it if I find 30 there. And he said, Behold, I have taken upon myself to speak to the Lord. Suppose 20 are found there. And he answered, For the sake of 20, I will not destroy it. So you see, continuing, just all you need is just some righteous people. Okay. And then he said, Oh, let the Lord not be angry, and I will speak again but this once. Suppose 10 are found there. He answered, For the sake of 10, I will not destroy it. And the Lord went his way. When he had finished speaking to Abraham, Abraham returned to his place. Okay, so all of this pleading for mercy, and God repents each time. 50, no. 45, no. 40, no. 30, no. 20, no. 10, no. You will not destroy the city if there are 10 that are found righteous. Okay, chapter 19. The 2 angels came to Sodom in the evening. So the one was talking to Abraham, the other 2 went forward. And Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed his head himself with his face to the earth and said, My lords, turn aside, I pray you, to your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet. Hospitality. Then you may rise early and go your way. And they said, No, we will spend the night in the street. But he urged them strongly, so they turned aside to him and entered his house. And he made them a feast of baked unleavened bread, and they ate. Notice, leavened with Abraham, unleavened with Lot. Before they laid down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man, surrounded the house. And they called to Lot, Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us, that we may know them. Lot went out to the door to the men and shut the door behind him and said, I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Behold, I have 2 daughters who have not known man. Let me bring them out to you, and you may do with them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof. And they said, Stand back. And they said, This fellow man came to sojourn, and he would play the judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them. And then they pressed hard against the man Lot and drew near to break the door. But the men put forth their hands and brought Lot into the house with them and shut the door. And they struck with blindness the men who were at the door of the house, both small and great, so that they wearied themselves groping for the door. Okay, what's the point there? Now, obviously, what's being talked about there is improper relations, but let's be brutally honest, that is probably the worst sign of inhospitality there could be, to brutalize people who come innocent to your place, and all you seek to do is hurt them. That's all they're doing. They're not interested in having relationships with them. They just want to hurt them. They want to harm them because they have no sense of hospitality. Okay, they are selfish, they are greedy, they are evil. And unfortunately, there are not 10 of them that are any good. Okay. The men said to Lot, have you anyone else here, sons-in-law, sons, daughters, or anyone else you have in the city? Bring them out of the place. For we are about to destroy this place because the outcry against its people has become great before the Lord, and the Lord has sent us to destroy it. So Lot went out and said to his sons-in-law, who were to marry his daughters, up, get out of this place, for the Lord is about to destroy the city. But he seemed to his sons-in-law to be jesting. When the morning dawned, the angels urged Lot, saying, arise, take your wife with your 2 daughters who are here, lest you be consumed in the punishment of the city. But he lingered. So the men seized him and his wife and his 2 daughters by the hand, the Lord being merciful to him, and they brought him forth and set him outside of the city. So the angels compelled Lot and everyone in his family to leave. And when they had brought them forth, they said, flee for your life. Do not look back or stop anywhere in the valley. Flee to the hills, lest you be consumed. And Lot said to them, oh, no, my lords, behold, your servant has found favor in your sight, and you have shown me great kindness in saving my life. But I cannot flee to the hills, lest disaster overtake me, and I die. Behold, yonder city is near enough to flee to. Let it be a little one. Let me escape there. Is not a little one, and my life will be saved. And he said to him, behold, I grant you this favor also. I will not overthrow the city of which you have spoken. Make haste, escape there, for I can do nothing till you arrive there. Therefore, the name of that city is called Zoar. The sun has risen on the earth when Lot came to Zoar. Then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven. And he overthrew these cities, and the valley and all the inhabitants of the cities, and what grew on the ground. But Lot's wife behind him looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. And Abraham went early in the morning to the place where he had stood before the Lord, and he looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah, and toward all the land of the valley, and behold, lo, the smoke of the land went up like the smoke of a furnace. So it was, when God destroyed the cities of the valley, God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out of the midst of the overthrow, when he overthrew the cities in which Lot dwelled. So there we have an example of hospitality in what Abraham did with the 3. And then we have an example of inhospitality with the way that they were treated by the residents of Sodom. And because of their merciless inhospitality, they were destroyed. Okay. It is very important, I argue, that you keep those 2 stories together. Okay. They are meant to be told together. They're not meant to be read separately. Okay. It is an example of what becomes you when you are generous and kind, and what becomes you when you are not. It is meant to tell you a story that this is how you are to be. You are to show the compassion and hospitality that Abraham showed, and the compassion and hospitality that Lot showed. Lot showed that he was every bit the nephew of Abraham, in offering his hospitality to the angels, in giving them meals, and also in trying to save them from the people outside by even offering his own children. Okay, which we would consider abhorrent. And I mean, obviously they refused the offering anyway. But one thing to notice, I don't think those children had husbands anymore, because the husbands stayed behind. So what to take from this? What we take from this is that as people of God, we are expected, and it says this, Old Testament, New Testament, and everywhere past that, that we are to recognize that God is completely sovereign over us. God is our Lord, period. Number one. Number two, we are to love that God, our God, with our hearts, our minds, our souls, and our strength, everything that we have. Because if you really think about it, I don't think there's anything else that we have other than heart and mind and soul and strength. You know, just by going with mind and strength, we have everything that's physical and everything that's mental. Those are the two things that we generally categorize today in terms of our faculties. But the others, our spiritual being, yes, we have to love God with everything that we have. Okay. And then the next thing, love our neighbors as ourselves. And so what we see in the example that we saw in Leviticus is we see that our love is expressed by letting the poor and the resident alien take from the overflow of our work to till the fields. We are not to grab everything for our profit or our gain. We are to leave some behind for the well-being of those around us. And then the other is that we show that hospitality to the strangers. He didn't know who they were when he came and ran to them and fell on his face. They made the promise about Sarah having a child, but there's still that, you know, it's an ambiguity. We know that the Lord is the Lord and that that is who is visiting Abraham. But at that point, Abraham is just going to show his mercy, compassion, and hospitality towards those people. Okay. And so that becomes the foundation for how people in the Old Testament were to treat both their kin and their God and the stranger. Okay. All right, so the next time we get together, which I think can be next week, I am going to be at a retreat sometime soon, but I think for right now, yeah, I'm good. So October 2nd, we'll meet again, and we're going to talk about the prophets just for a little while, and then we're going to move into the New Testament. Okay, prophets. Talk about the prophets, and then we'll talk about the New Testament. Any questions? Yes.
Yeah. So you had mentioned that Lot and Abraham, one got leavened and one got unleavened
Right.
bread. So I have two questions. One, what is the difference between
okay,
unleavened
right?
Why?
That's a foretelling. Okay, just like how Moses had to flee really quickly after Pharaoh let him go. Finally, Lot had to leave really quickly. Okay, because the city was about to be destroyed, so they didn't have time to let the bread rise. Okay, so unleavened bread. See, when you make bread, and if you're, I don't know, do you work? Okay, because we bake bread every other Tuesday here, and it's a really kind of fun thing to watch. We let the bread rise 3 times as we do that, and it takes a long time for that process to happen. Okay, so in order to make a bread, it has to rise, and like I said, I mean, in our case, 3 times. And so it's a long process. It's time consuming. But if you don't have time, if you just got to run, you don't put the leaven in, it never rises, so it stays flat. Okay, and then you're able to eat it on the run. Okay, now of course, if we made bread and froze it or whatever, we could eat it now, but that's not the point. So in Moses's time, they had to make the bread quickly because Pharaoh was going to say goodbye, and then he changed his mind, and they had to run. They had to flee. Okay, and so they fled. All right, and then we know the story of the passing through the sea as if on dry land and things like that. Okay, but so that was unleavened bread. That's why in the Jewish services for Passover, it's unleavened bread. That's why in the Catholic Church, when you receive the host, it's unleavened. Same thing, because they are trying to tap into the Passover Seder. We don't do that because we say that Christ is our leaven. He causes everything, enlivens everything. And so we use regular bread that rises as opposed to unleavened bread. Okay. So Lot made unleavened bread as a foretelling that he was going to have to get out of there quickly. He didn't have time to let the bread rise. It had to be done quick and get out of here. He wanted the angels to go quickly. He didn't want them to linger. He was hoping they could stay the night, okay, sleep and get out of there before people woke up and caused a problem. But obviously that didn't happen. Okay. You're welcome. Other questions? Yeah.
Do you think Abraham and Lot knew Sodom and Gomorrah was
doomed?
Yeah.
I don't think so. Well, I mean, Lot probably did because, you know, he was trying to satiate their horrible behavior, okay, by giving them something of prized possession. But Abraham was begging that they be spared. Okay, so no, I think he wanted God to be merciful to them. But also notice they never get to the point of, well, what about 5? Or what about 2? What if there's just 1? You never get to that point because at this point, God's like, look, it's going to happen.
Yeah.
Okay. And there's nothing Abraham can do at that point. He has already begged for the mercy that's appropriate. And if you can't find 10 good people in a city that's immense, then you have a problem, right? Okay. Yeah. Good question, though. Other questions, comments, concerns? Mother, do you have anything?
No, I just find it really interesting in the translations that the 3 men are referred to as Lord. You know, I think that's in part where we get the Trinity,
right?
You know, the 3 men at the table.
Right. Yes, I agree. Yeah, I would like to look at the Hebrew, and then I'd also like to look at the Greek, because I suspect there's a slight deviation in the two.
There's an icon of this, right?
Right, absolutely. The hospitality of Abraham. It's called, we call it the icon of the Trinity, because, and we can take a look at that next week maybe, which is there are definite Trinitarian references in that. Yeah. Other questions?
That's very good.
All right, cool. Thank you.
Very good.
God bless you.
Very good.
Thank you.
Was Lot's wife didn't make it, right?
No, she did not.